Hi, you're listening to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show podcast. If you're studying the subject at GCSE, A-level, foundation, degree, or any other discipline, then this podcast could be of help to you. If you have a question for the show, then you can email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com, and one of the teachers, lecturers, examiners, or experts will answer your question for you. You can sponsor the show on the GoFundMe page and subscribe on all the usual podcast platforms. If you're going to class, going to the gym, or just chilling, put your headphones in and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. You can visit tutor2u.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so the focus of this episode is an introduction to Marxism, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Nick Stevenson from the University of Nottingham. Nick, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about Marxism, and we're going to do the same as we did for functionalism, in that we're going to assume no prior knowledge for the listener. So we're going to start right from the very basics, if that's okay. So when you are introducing Marxism, Nick, how do you start for someone that's a complete layman to the topic?
Oh, that's quite a difficult question, actually. I think if I was starting off with Marxism, the first thing I'd probably go to would be the Communist Manifesto. Written over 170 years ago now, and some of the language is difficult, but actually I can remember reading it when I was 16, and I grew up in a poor working class family in Derby in the Midlands, and what really struck me was it gave me some sort of explanation as to why it was that we were poor, and that at the centre of the book is a story about a antagonism that goes all the way through capitalism that there's no getting away from. So it's not about what your identity is, it's not about how nice people are, it's ultimately about a story about opposed interests. And the first page of the Communist Manifesto makes it clear. I think the first line says, "The history of hitherto societies is the history of class conflict." So there, Marx is looking back and saying, well, we've always had class conflict. So it's not particularly just a feature of capitalism. There have always been opposed classes. It's just that under capitalism, the class conflict that we have is really naked. And it's really obvious, or it should be. It's becoming increasingly obvious. That is, in the period that Marx wrote, that we have the owners of the means of production, which might be called technology, factories, land, those sorts of things, and then we have the working class, who really all they have is their labor power to sell, and the return of which they get a wage. But it's an exploitative relationship, because ultimately the surplus value or the profits that are made by the capitalists are kept by the small owning class. And the relevance to today will be that we saw in the Occupy movement after the global crash in 2008, would be people started to talk about the 1% versus the 99%. This is Marxism, really. This is the idea that there is a capitalist class and the rest of us have different interests to this class, is what Marx talked about all those years ago, 170 years ago.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because some people might say that Marxism is historical or out of date, but it's interesting, as you say, that it could be as relevant now as it's ever been, actually.
Yeah, that's right. I think so. I think that one of the things that one of the reasons that people are still finding Marxism interesting is because, not only do we live in a society of class conflict, so some of people might listen to this program of watch the American elections debate, and there we have two incredibly wealthy, powerful men arguing about who's going to take control of the United States. They both belong to, the kind of elite of that particular society, and particularly Donald Trump, who is a, billionaire represents oil interests, etc., etc., and who refuses to take things like climate change seriously. And a Marxist explanation about this is that it's not because Trump is a buffoon, but it's in his material interest to do so. There's an awful lot of money to be made out of destroying the environment, unfortunately. You know, there's a lot of money to be made out of fossil fuels. There's a lot of money to be made out of the aviation businesses. This is one of the reasons why we found it so difficult to deal with. We've known about climate change now for an enormous amount of time, and we found it really hard to do something about it. It's because there's a property owning class who will not recognize that it's in their interest to start losing money over it.
Yeah. And you mentioned just now as well this idea of the split between the owners and the workers. And Marx referred to these as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, didn't he?
That's right, yeah.
Do you mind expanding on that a little bit more? Because I often find students struggle with kind of the language sometimes attached to Marxism.
Okay, yeah. I mean, sometimes the bourgeoisie are referred to as, people think of them as the middle class somehow, and that is not what Marx meant about them. What Marxism meant about them is that they were the property owning class. And the problem with capitalism is the problem of private property. And what he didn't mean by that is, you know, people say, well, you know, against private property, that's weird. Does he mean that, I don't know, I've inherited this rather nice watch off my grandmother? Is in a communist society, would they kind of be knocking at the door and taking that away from me? Okay, he doesn't mean it in that way. He means the ways in which that we produce wealth in our society, the ways in which we produce goods that people need, that ultimately that is driven by a system of private property. It's driven by a system of profit, and that most of the things that drive our system along are still money. And what Marx is concerned about is what happens in a world where money is the dominant value. Okay, and Marx is pointing out here, I think, that this is a historical phenomenon. It's not something that's normal or natural, or there's nothing we can do about it. He's trying to say there's a particular kind of society where people become obsessed with money, where they become obsessed with wealth, where they're looking for profit. And this idea then also gets into our social relationships as well. It's not just that it's about owning and controlling things. Then you get into where it gets into people's psyche, where they start wanting to own and control people, where they want they find it really hard to develop reciprocal relationships, etc. And the point of Marxism really was that, wouldn't it be better if, rather than the global 1% owning and controlling the land, owning and controlling things like Amazon and so on, rather than this wealth being concentrated into this tiny proportion of the globe's population, where I think the carbon footprint of the global 1% is about the same as the bottom 50% of the world, rather than a world that's like that, wouldn't it be better if we could redistribute resources, but also that we could give people a sense of ownership and control over the places in which they worked, over the environment, over the society in which they live, rather than everything being owned and controlled by this sort of property class. And not only does it mess up our workplaces, the environment and so on, it also has an effect upon politics too, because one of the scandalous suggestions that Marx makes in Capital is that actually the bourgeoisie also control politics. They also control parliaments too, or they control the American elections, because, again, to make the point, these two billionaires who are competing against one another in the American elections, they both really represent the dominant, powerful interests of American society. That's not to diminish the differences between the two of them, but that ultimately what happens is that capital, or the bourgeoisie, are able to exert their control over politics as well. So, yeah, and now you could also argue that we've now become a commercially driven society, unlike any other that's ever existed. That we are the most commercially driven society that the world has ever seen. You know, that capitalism is now a kind of global phenomena. So Marx talked about that in the Communist Manifesto. He talked about it becoming global, but this is now something that even Marx may well have been surprised, the extent to which it's just simply spread out across the world, and there doesn't seem to be an alternative to it at the moment.
And you mentioned about the idea of the people at the bottom, or the proletariat. Marx writes extensively about sometimes they're not aware of the fact that they're being exploited, this false class consciousness. Do you mind saying a little bit
Yeah.
more? Why aren't people aware of their exploitation and rising against it?
Right. Okay. Yeah. False consciousness is a really problematic term in the history of Marxism. There are some Marxists who want to continue using that argument, because the idea would be that we like to think of ourselves as individuals, and that we go about our daily lives and we make decisions of our own, and we're all kind of informed about the decisions which we make. Well, what Marxism wants to do is to start asking questions. And this was something which people in the Frankfurt School in the 1920s, 1930s started to think about, people like Erich Fromm, Adorno, other Marxists, because it's important to remember that Marxism is a tradition as well. One of the questions they started to ask was, well, to what extent do we really have our own ideas? When you meet somebody and they give you their opinions, where have they come from? Are they really their own opinions? Are they these things that they've deeply thought about? Or are they just parroting things that they've heard in the mass media? And for Marxists, they would point, well, the mass media actually are also integrated into this sort of society that's dominated by private property. Most of the press are owned and controlled by, again, a kind of billionaire class. And that's not to say that people are just puppets of the system. I don't think it's quite that straightforward. But the idea that you can actually become an individual and simply have your own thoughts in a society that's saturated by the interests of capitalism is actually quite complex. So some people then say, well, actually you become falsely conscious about your position because you're encouraged to do so, because there's lots of writing, there's lots of mass media which encourages you to think of yourself in ways which actually are quite misleading. Well, other Marxists have been worried about the idea of false consciousness. They're worried that it's a bit patronizing to say to somebody that they're suffering from false consciousness and they really need to have their consciousness raised by the Marxist Party or by the Marxist intellectual elites to kind of lead them to the road to liberation, etc. And there's been a lot of writing and concern about that particular sort of idea. I must admit, I can see the problems with it, but I personally wouldn't want to give it up altogether, because clearly you can be somebody who's become falsely conscious of your class position. You might, again, to go back to Donald Trump, think that there's something of that kind that's going on in the United States, that lots of working class people will look at Trump and see him as representing their interests. How can that be? How can someone like Trump, who's clearly a very dangerous character, who doesn't seem to care about the future of the planet, who's mainly concerned with his own business interests and so on, how is it that he is the person who's representing the interests of the working class? Maybe there is a space for some idea of false consciousness if we think about it in those sorts of ways.
And then you just mentioned this idea of the movement to the promised land, if you like, because one of the areas that students often ask is the kind of distinction between communism and socialism. You know, often the words are interchanged, but they do mean something quite different, don't they? What is the distinction between the two?
Okay. Well, you could argue that the politics of the 20th century has been dominated, particularly after 1945, by something you might refer to as social democracy. And the idea would be that over the course of the 20th century, many people started to think, well, firstly, given the disaster of the Russian Revolution, given that really just turned into a state dictatorship, is really a revolution such a great idea? And actually, can't we make society better simply by introducing reforms? We can have a welfare state, we can introduce free health service, free public libraries, free education. The dangers of going into a communist society might be that we ended up with a state-dominated society. So, it's not to say that social democracy does away with class conflict altogether, because there's still a class conflict which is there within social democracy, because there's a competition over profit that's going on. To what extent are profits going to be there for taxation? Can they then be used to redistribute resources in society? Or are they going to be spent on private forms of consumption by people like Jeff Bezos and so on? Is he going to buy himself a yacht or I read recently that the new plaything of the global elite is a underground submarine that you privately own. Okay,
Yeah.
these things cost way beyond the reach of most ordinary people like me or you. So yeah. There are those kind of issues. So yes, there's still a class conflict going on within social democracy. But yes, they gave up on the idea of communism. I think communism is more the idea that, if you go back to Marx, is the idea that actually workplaces, what mattered to Marx was that people were dominated in their work. Okay, going back to the Communist Manifesto, there's a line in it where he says that the workers are reduced to being appendages of machines. And by that, he meant the minute you go into your workplace, you're faced by, people who are there to tell you what to do. And if you don't follow the orders, then, you're probably going to be out. And they're not interested in your creativity. They're not interested in your ideas. They're interested in buying your labor power. And that's what they pay you to do. They don't pay you to think. They don't pay you to come up with new observations. They don't pay you to criticize. And in fact, if you do too much of that, they might end up getting rid of you. Okay. So there's a hierarchical relationship, basically, which is really alienating. And the way to get beyond that, and Marx saw this as a form of dehumanization. He saw human beings not as the common sort of idea at the moment, that we're all kind of competitive beings, and that we're all really acquisitive and we want wealth and we just want to grab things for ourselves. Okay, he had an idea that actually human beings were communal creatures, and that we cared about one another, and we cared about the communities in which we live, and so on, but also that we were creative beings as well. Human beings were, incredibly creative, whereas animals he saw as being mainly driven by their instincts. Human beings could, write symphonies. They could, create wonderful works of art. They could also be creative in their work. Marx was very concerned about the destruction of craft and so on. So he really didn't like factory production and what that was doing to people. So his basic idea was that what you really need to do is get rid of the property owning class and bring these things into common ownership, so that people then could have a say in their workplaces and they could have some sense of control over them. The way I usually explain this to students, if I can just go on for a second, is imagine two bakeries. Okay, there's the capitalist bakery and there's the communist bakery. The capitalist bakery is owned by, let's imagine, one person, and he employs his employees, okay? And he gives them a wage. And it's in his interest to pay them as little as possible, and they all have to do what they're told, and if they don't do what they're told, they're probably out, okay? What he's interested in is maximizing profit. So he wants to buy himself a new house, or he wants to buy himself some luxury consumption. He wants to provide for his family, but that's kind of what he wants to do, okay? But it's mainly he's driven by profit. A communist bakery, in more Marxist terms, would work somewhat differently. There would be no one owner. The idea is that the people who worked there were there. They were the ones who controlled it. So they would do so. They would run it in a much more democratic sense. They would think, well, how much do we need to be paid each week? How much money do we need to spend on the bread? Okay, the idea would be is that things would be much more equitable, be much more shared. Yes, there'll be more arguments, because once you get rid of hierarchy, things do become more complex. So and so's not working hard enough. I've done more than my share this week. We'd also have to sit down and talk to one another about it. These things are going to be complex, but the idea is that we share, but also, I think Marx thought, they would also consider the needs of the community. So we're not just there to maximize our profit, we're also there to make sure that the bread that we make is of a really good quality, but also that it's not pricing people out, okay? So that we can make sure that the poor can come in and enjoy the bread that we're there to be that we make each week. We've got some sense of a social obligation towards the society in which we live in. Now, that might sound really idealistic, okay, but there are bakeries that you can visit. There's one that I went to in Paris not long ago that was run along these lines, okay? It is possible to do that, but in a capitalist society, people think it's natural to organize things with a boss and workers following orders and them getting a wage and so on and so forth. But Marx offered us a different vision about how we could organize the workplace. So yeah, it's that really that's, I think, is the key to the kind of communist idea, which, social democracy, what did it do? It had a welfare state, it redistributed wealth. All these things are really important. Most socialists would applaud these things, but it doesn't go that kind of final step, if you like, in terms of democratizing workplaces. In fact, it did very little in that respect.
You do realise. No, I was just thinking, you do realise that every teacher's going to be stealing that idea now. Split the class into two. One of them pretend to be a capitalist bakery and one a communist bakery. I love that idea.
Right, okay.
Thank you, Nick. That is going to be the end of part one. In part two, we'll explore Marxism a little bit further. Hi, welcome back to part two. I'm talking to Dr. Nick Stevenson about Marxism. Nick, can I ask you something else? And another thing that students often struggle with is that Marxism has different branches, different brands. Marxism, neo-Marxism, Marxist feminism. What's a good way to understand the difference between those different branches?
Okay, that's a really complex question, but putting it very, very bluntly, there's a history of Marxist thinking, and there are different branches of Marxism. So historically, Marxism, has tried to develop different kinds of Marxism, I think, probably in the wake of what you might call Leninist Marxism, or the Marxism that took root in the Russian Revolution. And there's been an attempt by Marxists to think, well, we need to do a lot of rethinking here, because the Russian Revolution didn't produce this wonderfully liberated society that Marx hoped that it would. Okay, so are there things that we can still take from Marxism, but that we need to think about it in different ways? And also that Marx wrote in, as I say, 170 years ago, the beginning of the Russian Revolution, what would a Marxism look like in a kind of post-industrial society like the one we're living in now? Is Marxism still relevant to those sorts of things? So there's a sort of, Marxism is a what I would call a critical theory, in that it needs to constantly rethink itself. It shouldn't be that Marxism turns itself into a dogma, like a religion, that it's just, sorry to be those people who are religious, because actually religions aren't really like that either, but it would turn itself into a dogma that simply is there to be repeated and learned, and these are the rules and so on and so forth. Okay, that's not really the idea. The idea would be that it would need to be rethought historically. Now, in doing that, Marxism has also attracted a lot of criticism, that it didn't say enough about race, for example. Okay, however, there's a history of black Marxism. We can point about people like C.L.R. James, Franz Fanon, people like that. Also, there's this idea of, well, okay, if it doesn't say enough about race, and it doesn't say very much about gender. Okay, so there's been a feminist critique of Marxists, but there are now people who call themselves, Marxist feminists or socialist feminists, who think, well, actually, Marx is onto something. Marxism is on something. It's this idea of the workplace needing to be democratized, the impact of capital, and so on. But actually, it also needs to think about questions to do with gender, okay, and the ways in which society is, dominated by a certain group of men, or a certain idea of masculinity, and so on, and doesn't really say enough about the kind of power relationships which go on within the home, etc. Okay, so there are different. I think people have been very receptive to sort of some of Marx's ideas, but thought that really it needs to be made more complex. And it needs to be able to address things like gender. It needs to be able to address things like race. I think what makes these well, why not just jettison Marxism altogether? I think what they're taking from it is that to be, a kind of a liberatory feminism, or to have a liberating black politics, we also need to say something critical about capitalism as well. Okay, so for example, let me give one example. There's quite a well-known black Marxist feminist called Angela Davis, who people may have heard of. She's quite interesting to look up if you've not read in any of her writing. And one of the things that she talks about is the need to abolish prisons in the United States. She's an abolitionist. So the idea would be that we need to move to a world where, we're not incarcerating huge numbers of Black Americans in the United States. And you might think, well, what's Marxist about that particular argument? She's making that argument because it tends to be that Black people who are disproportionately incarcerated. They're also, as we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, raising up questions about police brutality and so on. Now, but what Angela Davis does is to say, however, these arguments, a more liberated world for Black people is not really compatible with capitalism, because Black people are also the people, and not just subjugated in terms of their race, but overwhelmingly tend to be working class and poor. So we need to look at capitalism. And one of the things that's driving, she argues in her work, that's driving the need to incarcerate people is the fact that in the United States, prisons are privately owned. So there's money to be made out of. So this sort of idea that somehow we can kind of get justice for Black people at the same time in a capitalist system then becomes really difficult, because they're making money out of putting Black people behind bars. Okay, so we need to be able to address capitalism and race at the same time, and that's one of the arguments that she makes. So yes, I think that people are drawing on Marx because of the anti-capitalist critique that lies at the heart of it, but they're making it more complex by adding other arguments to it. It depends on the context, I suppose.
Yeah, is a similar argument to Marxist feminism, that to deconstruct patriarchy, you must deconstruct capitalism first?
I think, yeah, that's right. So under capitalism, women who tend to be the carers in the home are doing all this work for free. They're looking after their children, they're doing all this work in the home, and it's not seen as work. Okay, it's seen as just something that people kind of do, right? But this is the root part of the root of women's exploitation, that they're actually working, but it's not seen as work in a capitalist society, because to work means to go out of the house and sell your labor to somebody. But women are also doing lots of work which is not recognized as such in the home. So if we then began to recognize that women were doing all this work in the home, this would then ask questions about the economic structure more generally, about why it is that the whole system seems to be dependent upon all this unpaid labor that's being done by women. So again, there's a connection there between patriarchy and capitalism.
And you just mentioned Angela Davis there, and you've obviously mentioned Marx. For people new to the area, who else would you advise reading? Which other theorists are kind of the big hitters, if you like, within Marxism?
Oh, that's really difficult. For me at the moment, I would really recommend that people have a look at Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse was somebody who wrote in the 1960s and wrote this book called One Dimensional Man. And there's been a really interesting follow-up to that book by somebody called Nina Power, called One Dimensional Woman. And one of the things that's interesting about Marcuse is he tried to say in the 60s, well, actually, we need to rethink Marx now. We're in a, technological society. We're not really in this world where, any longer where there's this mass impoverished population. Yes, there are still poor people, but this sort of society that's driven by kind of want and need is not there in the same sort of way, and it's wrong to say it is so. Also, we've become a much more consumer-orientated society, okay? And Marcuse really began to ask questions about that, and it was my one-dimensional man. What he meant was that we live in a world where the forces that used to oppose capitalism have ultimately become incorporated into the system. So there was a labor movement which opposed capitalism, which wanted to kind of push for a different sort of society, that felt that capitalism was always going to be a trap and that we couldn't be emancipated while we still had capitalism. But ultimately, it's been bought off. People now go to work and they earn their money, they come home and they sort of consume. Right, and Nina Power makes the same sort of book, same sort of argument, that feminism at one point was really kind of critical and that made demands about the redistribution of wealth. I wanted to talk about male violence. Wanted to talk about the ways in which women were exploited within the home. They wanted to talk about the ways in which women's bodies were commodified and used to sell products and so on. And yet now what's happened is it's been incorporated into the mainstream. There's nothing terribly threatening any longer about the labour movement, or in Nina Power's terms, about feminism, because ultimately I remember seeing David Cameron saying that he was a feminist, and Theresa May saying, oh, actually I'm a feminist. I know we haven't had Boris Johnson say that. We're probably waiting rather long time before we've heard that. But she's making quite a good point there, that it, there's something about what Marcuse is pointing about. There's something about mainstream society that what it does is it takes things from oppositional movements. It incorporates them into the structure, and it takes away their kind of their ability to sort of criticize. It makes things safe, if you like. So feminism has been made safe somewhere, or maybe social democracy is something which is kind of Marxism or socialism being made safe. All it wants to do is to push for extra money for the workers. What we're missing in all of this is a society where we can become free. And for Marcuse, we can't become free in a world where we're continuing having to sell our labour to other people. Yeah. We can only become free if we have some sort of control over workplaces and so on. But even more than that, he says that actually the technology that we have now that gives us huge possibilities to live in a world where we don't spend all our time working. Okay, and it's only a socialist, Marxist, communist answer to these problems where this can happen. All right, so capitalism wants to keep us, noses to the grindstone, working away, etc., etc. Whereas in fact we have all this fantastic technology, which if it started to work for the benefit of the community, we could all be working a lot less. We could be spending our time learning new skills, or playing sports, or writing poetry, or not to get too romantic about this, but making love, or whatever it is. We could live much more sort of liberated lives. But because we're having to spend all our time working, and it's true that people now, are working, if they have jobs, they're working harder and longer hours than they've ever had before. And so Marcuse thought, well, if you really want to live a sort of self-determined life, a life where you really are in control of your destiny, and you get to decide what it is that you want to do. You can't be spending all your time at work. Okay, so we need to reduce that as much as possible. But that's never going to be possible in capitalism, which wants to keep you sweating, wants to keep you worried about your next paycheck is going to come from. We need to organize society quite differently to make these things possible.
Yeah, that was always the prediction, wasn't it? Once we had automation and once we had technology to do our housework and to do all our jobs, that we'd have more free time, and it's gone completely the other way. That's
right, yeah. But it's interesting that a lot of these debates are being returned to at the moment. Yeah. This argument has come back because there was a report that was done by a bank that did it. I can't remember the exact source now, but they talked about in the next 20 years, about a fifth of the jobs is going to be disappeared by automation. Okay, so you think under a capitalist system, what's that going to look like? That's going to look like a world where people are scrambling around trying to earn a living. They'll be lucky if they've got a reasonable job that pays a decent wage. Okay, so automation is seen to be a threat under capitalism, whereas the idea would be that under a socialist society where you don't have a dominant exploitative class, this technology could work for the benefit of all of us. Okay, by reducing our labor time. But under capitalism, that's almost impossible, because what will happen is that it's driven by the need to make profit, then driven by the need to make money for this very small kind of ruling elite. It's not there to benefit everybody. It's not there to benefit the whole of the community. So we're never going to realize entirely what technology can do for us in such a kind of narrow society that just values money, just values making profit. What happens if we started to value other things? We could only really do that if we brought the means of production, if you like, into common ownership, then we could start organising ourselves quite differently. That would be the argument anyway.
Yeah. And I want to ask you one last thing, if you don't mind. I did say half an hour, but we've gone a little bit over, if you don't mind, because I'm sure as a teacher you always get this, but students always say Marxism, nice idea in theory, in practice doesn't work. That's often the argument, isn't it? That communism is a nice theory, but it doesn't work. What do you say to that? Because that's the most common critique I hear about the discipline.
Yeah. Okay. I hate to say people who say that, but it is a bit lazy to say that. Okay, it's a bit of a cliche to say that, and so I suppose the reason I've agreed to do this interview is I'm trying to encourage you to think beyond the cliche a little bit. Now, I understand why people say that, because what they really mean is the Russian Revolution and what happened in Eastern Europe, and that that they find it very hard then to find examples of places where these things have been implemented and been shown to work. But one place we might look is the Spanish Revolution. Okay, that is never really looked at in any great detail. This was a period where people realised genuinely, kind of an alternative way of life, that they move beyond capitalism. If you don't believe me, read George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. He was there during the Spanish Revolution in the 1930s. He gave this first-hand account about what happened in that society. Now, yes, it was defeated. It was crushed by Stalin. It was also crushed by Franco and so on. It's defeated by war, but at least for a short period, you could see what a more liberated society beyond capitalism might actually look like. Also, you might also say historically, I would say, yes, the Communist Manifesto was written 170 years ago, but actually we're only in the early stages of Marxism. We've only just begun. Yes, there were problems with the Russian Revolution, and Marxists have tried historically to learn from those sorts of things. But there is, I think, to keep making the point really that do you really want to live in a world which people, millions of people each night are starving, have nothing to eat, are scrambling around for bread, while you have people like, and again, it's nothing about them personally, Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, and have so much money they don't know what to do about that. I mean, isn't that really morally shocking? Are you saying that it really isn't possible to organize ourselves differently from that? I just don't accept that. I think that, yes, so it's not the idea that the kind of perfect world is about to emerge tomorrow, but it's about that actually there are still some quite key ideas here that we might still think about into the 21st century. And actually in the context of the ecological crisis, it's quite possible that these ideas are more urgent than ever, because the idea that capitalism can solve the ecological crisis, if you want wishful thinking, I think there it is.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't see a society that's entirely driven by profit that continues to make money out of ecological collapse. Is that really a society that's going to be able to solve these problems? I don't think so.
No. And I hope that has got people thinking as well, because like you said, the idea that we just live to work does seem crazy. It seems crazy. Yeah. I really, really appreciate your time and your explanations. I think students are really going to enjoy this and learn a lot from it. So, Nick, thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.